just a little bit about myself so that you know something about me. This is a picture of my family from about a year ago. So I'm a happy and proud grandfather. My wife's there to my right, and then my daughter just a little bit more to the left, my son and the other son. My daughter and son are in the Czech Republic, and my other son, way over here on the left side, is serving in Albania. I serve with an organization called Josiah Venture. John already mentioned this. Our vision is a movement of God among the youth of Central and Eastern Europe that finds its home in the local church and transforms society. So we care about young people, we care about disciple making, we love the local church, and we want to see young leaders equipped to fulfill Christ's commission through the local church. So our team works with about 5,000 leaders in the course of a typical year. So I love leadership. I love thinking about leadership. And when Josiah Venture began in 1993, this is what our whole team looked like. So it was, we were actually meeting in a storeroom. My middle son took the picture and he couldn't hold the camera very high, so we all had to bend down to get into this. And this was the size of our team when we began, just two couples. Then a third couple joined us. And I remember the first crisis that happened when our team couldn't sit in a circle anymore. And there wasn't time for everyone to share for a half an hour how they were doing. And I remember thinking when our team was about 15, how in the world could I ever manage a team any larger than this? This is already getting so complex. Well, God often calls us to things way beyond us, and this is what the Josiah Venture team looks like today. We have 350 on our staff serving in 16 countries. And it's been a challenge at many steps along the way as the organization has grown. These are the countries we're involved in. But when we were starting at this stage, I couldn't imagine how in the world could I lead more than 10 or 15 people. And one of the things that I found as the organization grew is that sometimes the things that worked really well at the beginning stopped working. And every stage of growth required for me a different kind of leadership. I felt like I had to learn leadership all over again. And in the process, in these last years, I've been involved in starting about 15 different nonprofit organizations. So I've been in the nonprofit sector a lot, some of them small, some of them that have grown larger. And in the process, one of the things that's been most helpful for me is learning about organizational life cycles, which is our question that we have in front of us right now. One of the things that was so helpful to me was realizing that organizations develop in similar predictable ways as kids do. You can see my middle son right there in front of us. He has a pacifier in his mouth. Now he has kids of his own. But when he was this stage, everything was new. What's it like to have a baby? But what I realized is people all around the world had babies, and I could learn from what they'd learned about leading a baby or leading a teenager. And in the same way, organizations, when they're babies, they have similar characteristics. When they're toddlers, they have similar characteristics. When they're teenagers, they have characteristics. And even though that phase of development is new for us, it's not necessarily new to the organizational world. So one of the things that can be very helpful is studying classic organizational life cycles, and figuring out where our organization is in that cycle. So today I'm going to tell you, go through 4 different organizational life cycle theories very quickly, and then show you some of the things that are common in all of them, and talk about how to apply some of the insights from organizational life cycle theory to the growth of your team or your church or your particular organization. So we'll start with this first one. This is Larry Greiner, one of the early theorists in organizational life cycles. He came out with this in 1972, so a while ago. He outlined out 5 phases of the growth of organizations. He was particularly thinking like large corporations and in the business world. Let me just make a couple of interesting observations. He talked about this early stage that was a growth through creativity. It's kind of that you're starting it up, you're thinking of new things, and you grow because you have ideas that are worth something and worth something to others. But then he said there's a crisis of leadership that happens because all of the ideas can't just be done through you, and there needs to be leadership of other people who could do ideas. You have to build a team. And so after that crisis, it grows through this direction. So you begin to direct others. Maybe get some people working with you, or some assistants, or someone to help to develop the ministry. But then, as you begin to direct, there's a crisis of autonomy, which means the people that are working closely with you are getting to the point where they go, do I just do what you as a leader tells me to do, or can I make any choices of my own? And the team then starts to ceiling out on the prime leader is doing everything, and everyone else is just kind of following along. By the way, many churches actually peak out at the top of this phase too. They're limited by the gifting of the pastor, because there's a main pastor who's expected to do everything, and then everyone else is kind of waiting for instructions or wondering when he's going to move them forward. So as they have this crisis of autonomy, you grow through delegation, delegating things out. But then there comes a crisis of control, because something happens that's called cellular fragmentation. Things go out into all these different areas, but then they can kind of start spinning out on their own. And so there's a crisis of, I've delegated things out, but wow, I'm starting to lose control. It's not fitting together. And after that, there's a phase 4, growth through coordination, tying those pieces together. But then there's a crisis of red tape. That coordination starts to become bureaucratic and difficult, and you have to break through that to a place of growth through collaboration. That's the age of an organization, young to mature. Very interesting to see these 5 phases, and I'm just going to give you an overview of these different theories, because you'll see some things in common with all of them as we go on. So that's Larry Greiner. Here's another one. This is Ordained. He came out with this theory in 1999, and you'll see some similarities. If you look at organizational life cycles, you'll often see him cited. He had some different kinds of names. What's interesting is he also had 5 phases on the area of growth up till prime. But then he also talked about what happens in an organization after it goes off the top and heads back down again. And some of you have seen this organizational life cycle theory that takes an organization up and then down again. And he talks about courtship, infancy. This is like that creative phase. But he also highlights key dangers in each of these phases, that an affair. And basically what he means there is you've got a great idea, but then you've got another great idea, and then another great idea, and you can't stick with the one thing that you feel called to. Then infancy. One of the difficulties here is infant mortality. They say many startup companies fail in their first 5 years, and they often fail. They fail because they're fragile. Startup churches fail because they're fragile. Startup nonprofit organizations fail because they're fragile. They don't have much money. They don't have much infrastructure. The founder's having to do everything. And in that fragility, often the church or the nonprofit organization will actually die. It won't make it through there. Then there's this go growth time, and the trap here he talks about is the family or the founder or family trap. So that the founder has to kind of keep everything in their hands, or keep everything close to them and only the people they trust. And because of that, the organization ceilings out. He talks about adolescence and divorce. What's interesting here is he says the danger here is what he calls divorce, and that's the key leader just gets tired. He's grown it from this bottom to up here, and now it's in this key stage of growth, and the leader's out of gas, premature aging. He's ready to do something else. Or else the leader loves starting things, and now it's boring. It's growing, but he wants to start something else. And so you have this unfulfilled entrepreneur, kind of these serial entrepreneurs that start things and just get them going and then leave them. They're trying to get to this area of prime where the organization or team or church is really functioning at its top capacity. It's bringing lots of fruit. It's working really well. But what often happens is then it starts to fall. So complacency clicks in, aristocracy, which basically means that people are just trying to hold on to their positions. And then recrimination, we're just blaming other people for what's going on, heads into bureaucracy, and then death. So this is Adazis's theory, quite interesting. Wondering, he's thinking again about corporations, but it can have some application to the church world as well. Okay, let's hit another one. This one is done by Susan. You'll see it to the right. I have to look it up. Susan Kenny Stevens and Judith Sharkin Simon in about 211, and they really focused on the nonprofit world and nonprofit life cycles. And again, you're going to see some similarities. You'll see that they have 4 up phases and 2 down, whereas Adazis had 5. But there's some similarities. It goes from the idea to the startup to the growth phase to maturity, and then they talk about decline. And I'm thankful here that they have this turnaround phase. You can possibly turn around that decline and head back, and then crisis or death. And they do work in dividing up what needs to happen into these areas of impact, governance, culture and operations, revenue and brand. Again, focused on the nonprofit world, but their insights can be very helpful and interesting. And some of the reasons why I'm exposing you to these theories is you might want to dig in deeper and read some of the things that they've written in some of these theories. And I have resources at the end of my notes if you want to dig deeper into that. Here's another version of of Stevens and Simon's life cycle, where they'll go through and just talk about rating your programs and your management and your governance through these various stages, and then obviously seeing the turnaround. So that's a nonprofit life cycle theory. I'm going to give you one more. I'm giving you 4, and again, you're going to see some similarities between them. Here's the 4th, and this was actually when I started in ministry, when the team was about that small team that I showed you. This was the one that I was taught, and it's been super helpful for me. I was taught it by a man named Dan Spader, who did an in-depth study of the life of Christ and talked about how ministries develop and grow over time. And basically, he talked about 5 phases of the growth of Christ's ministry and how Jesus grew his ministry through those 5 phases, which was super fascinating for me. He talked about the preparation of a leader, which in Christ's life took 30 years, and some of the key priorities that the Father worked on with his Son during that time. And then he talked about this break point that happened when Christ was baptized, and then highlighted the fact that in the first year and a half of Christ's ministry, he only does 2 recorded miracles, and there's actually not much scripture written about that time. We know how long it lasted because of several feasts, but it was a pretty long time of just focusing in on some key priorities, focusing in on his core, building his foundation. And then a key break point happens here when he calls the first 5 disciples and begins equipping them. He goes into an equipping phase, and very soon after that, there's an explosion of miracles, lots of crowds. There's this expanded evangelism, or this expansion phase, which he says are like 2 sides of the same coin. It happens in the same 6 to 9 months, but he didn't begin to expand before he built a base, a healthy core, and also began to call some people close to him and begin to equip them. And then the 5th phase, he talks about beginning when Jesus appointed the 12 and then sent the 12, sent the 72 and the 120, where he really begins leadership multiplication. So more than just the equipping of workers, he begins to multiply, and then you have the book of Acts carrying that multiplication further. This was a very interesting ministry life cycle theory from the life of Christ that was very helpful for me as I was thinking about, do I have these characteristics, a character call, and am I empowered? And then how do I build a healthy core at the beginning? And then what does it mean to begin to equip others? And then how do we push out into expansion? And then what does leadership multiplication look like in our setting? Now, I've put together this chart for you. So this is in the second document that you have, trying to kind of mash some of these organizational theories together, because it's interesting to see how much they have in common and what we can learn from each one of them. The first one is the nonprofit lifestyle stages, and I'm actually going to use their graphic because it's a very interesting summary. Though they have this turnaround that comes back to growth, but also there's a loop here at the top Well, we'll get to that in just a second when we get there. So their cycles are idea, startup, growth, maturity, decline, turnaround, and terminal. So the death of an organization. If you look at Sun Life's ministry phase from the life of Christ, you have similar preparation, then foundation, then this double phase of equipping and expansion, which would match with what Stephen says, and then this multiplication phase. Now, the life of Christ doesn't hit decline, turnaround, and terminal, but that was an interesting theory. That it's interesting to see how these different theories have so much in common. Or Atticus, he's got this courtship, infancy, adolescence, which would be this equipping expansion phase, then prime, and then he talks about the fall, aristocracy, recrimination, and then bureaucracy and death. So there's some parallel in that one. And Griner's really similar, growth through creativity, growth through direction. And he actually matches the Sun Life stages, growth through delegation and growth through coordination, which would be similar to that growth phase here. And then growth through collaboration. And he also doesn't run off the backside of the hill. So one of the interesting things we can see is that they're obviously observing real things that are out there, because there's a lot in common with each of these various theories. Now, obviously, the great thing would be, if you're in this area of maturity, would be to not go over into decline, but to keep regenerating. So you come back to vitality through constant innovation, and to stay in a circle right here. But you may be in an organization that's in decline, and you actually need to turn around and go back to growth. And you have to maybe go back to, like, as if you were just coming out of startup phase, and do a turnaround, which a turnaround is more drastic, because some of the changes you need to make are almost like restarting where you were before. Or you may be in an organization that's in a terminal phase, and it needs to be brought to a good end. Sometimes organizations pass their prime, and the best thing to do to them is do palliative care and turn the resources into another organization or another church. Sometimes it's best for a church to actually come to an end and bless a new church with their resources. So there are times when church structures or when nonprofit organizations actually reach the end of their productive time, and it would be better to bring them to a close and release the energy and the people into another organization that's thriving. So that's interesting to view these, how they relate together, and also very interesting to think about where you're at, because there will be some great insights from these organizational theories depending on where you're at. Here are some 4 key leadership insights from organizational life cycle theory. So 4 key leadership insights from the theories. I'm just looking at my time here, seeing how we're going. Here's the first one. Leadership priorities change depending on the phase of organizational development. So what you should be focusing on as a leader is different. What Jesus focused on the first year and a half of his ministry is different than what he focused the next year. His focus at the end of his time, when he was preparing for leadership multiplication, was different. And one of the difficulties is in catching these leadership priority changes. So you'll see right here what you focus here on the development of these ideas and then getting things started up. What you need in a startup is kind of to be able to do everything yourself. You've got to become a jack of all trades. You have to learn how to keep the finances, and you have to maybe make the website yourself, or learn to go do almost everything with no money. And there's a whole set of skills that's involved in a startup church, a startup organization, that actually those same skills start working against you as it grows, because that skill of doing everything just as cheap as you can and doing everything yourself and learning everything yourself begins to create a ceiling, and you can't go beyond that ceiling. So the focus then becomes something else in the next phase. And often leaders don't make those transitions, and they don't understand that their leadership style really changes depending on the needs of that particular phase. So that's one key observation. Let's go back to that. Leadership priorities change depending on the phase of organizational development. Here's a second. The transition to the next phase is experienced as a crisis that is either navigated by moving forward through a leadership shift, Greiner's revolution, he talks about evolution and revolution, or moving backward through increased effort into the same activities, just trying to maintain what already exists. So that you'll experience that as a crisis, and that crisis is not a fun crisis. So I remember when our team was about 30 people, and we were working in 4 countries, and we just totally topped out. I can remember just thinking, I can't work more hours, and the whole thing is kind of shaking. I'm barely holding it together, and we actually started experiencing decline. And from my standpoint, it was just, we're just going to work harder or back off a little bit. And a dear friend of mine who lives in California, he wrote me and said, I'm doing leadership consulting. Would you like me to come visit you? And I said, absolutely. And he came to the Czech Republic and sat down with me for 3 days and basically helped me through a crisis. I had to totally change the way I was leading. It was like a major gear shift. Restructure everything we were doing, change the way I was spending my energy. This leadership shift, it's like pushing in the clutch in a car and shifting into another gear. And let me tell you, it was painful. It was scary for me because I was leaving something that I knew how to do and changing to something I didn't, leaving a structure that had worked for a while and that we had outgrown. It was scary. In fact, if he hadn't helped me, I don't know that I would have managed. But what was interesting is once we made that transition, our ministry that was topped out at about 30 staff all of a sudden grew in the next several years quite quickly to 100. And it was actually easier to lead at 100 than it was at 30. What seemed to me like I can't handle one more, actually the leadership shift, the change in the way I was leading, the change in the way our organization was functioning, opened up lots of space. So sometimes we think, wow, our organization is just at the top. I couldn't do any more. But there's a leadership shift in the way you lead and in the way you structure and in the way you act that can open up space to the future. By the way, this circle continues even when you're in places of maturity. And I can give you some examples of, I've had to go through a leadership shift in the last 6 months that wasn't easy for me. But you can see one of the key shifts, the leadership shift that takes you into this phase, moving from current activities to waiting on God and listening to others. You actually have to create space for that idea. You have to create space for God's calling in you to really come to maturity so that you know exactly what He's calling you to do, creating space to think, act, and pray. A lot of people don't do this. So they never get an idea to the point where it could then become something that would work. Startup, well, you've got to move from careful preparation to risky, faith-filled action. You just got to get moving, and that's tough for people to make those changes. Startup to growth, moving from doing to equipping. So, and back again, even if you look at Jesus, you see Jesus after his baptism, then he's hanging out with his first disciples. He's going to a wedding up in Cana of Galilee. He's purposely wandering around a lot of places and connecting with John, who's also doing risky, faith-filled actions. Then moving from doing to equipping. So changing time, it's faster to do at the beginning than to equip, but allocating more of your time from actually doing the work to equipping others. And it's slow at first. It doesn't pay off in the beginning. Then this growth through coordination or this expansion, moving from incremental growth to exponential growth. And there's a whole different way of thinking. Instead of thinking how can we get 10% more people in our church, how can we plant 10 churches? Those are really different ways of thinking. And many people never switch to they're always in plus and they're never in multiplication mode. And they don't think about how to actually take something that's working and not just increase it by percentage, but multiply it times X. And you have to think differently. You have to plan differently. You have to build your team differently to go to exponential growth. Then this maturity, moving from equipping workers to actually multiplying leaders. And multiplying leaders is a different kind of activity. It takes different kind of energy, and you have to learn different kinds of skills. And then the leadership shift that takes you out of maturity is when you move from constant innovation to simply maintaining the stability and status quo. What will take you into turnaround is moving from excuses and explanation to honestly facing reality, asking the hard questions, and taking courageous action. And then the right kind of leadership here in the terminal is moving from holding on to the past to releasing resources to others for the future. And some organizations and churches, we actually need to shepherd to an honorable end. That really the time has come for that organization to release themselves into other organizations. Each phase brings a particular set of challenges and specific dangers. Growth comes when a leader focuses on the priority of those phases and avoids the dangers. So this is Greiner's evolution. You focus on the priorities and you watch out for the dangers. And in the chart I gave you, I just roughed out some various categories and some of the priorities of each of those phases and some of the dangers. And I'm not going to go there because it would take some time, but there's a bunch of possibilities outlined out in there. You can dig more into there are particular dangers, and then there are particular priorities that you have to work on in each of those phases. And then often the leadership activity that drives growth in one phase can hinder it in the next. So the very thing that helps you in the startup phase is what prevents you from going on and growing the organization. The very thing that helps you is you're equipping because you're giving nice direction and careful instruction. Well, that begins to hinder you as you hit expansion because you're going to have to let things loose. You're going to have to take risks and open things up. And then the same energy that, expansion, things are really starting to grow, but now you're going to actually have to take energy away from that growth and invest it in key leaders so that you can multiply leaders that can handle this. And often people don't make that leadership shift. So you'll find lots of organizations and churches topping out at the end of a phase and never moving beyond it. In fact, thinking that that's the limit of the potential of their church or of their organization, because the leader is not willing to go through the hard work of learning leadership into a new phase and changing the way they lead to drive growth. And one of the things that's fascinating for me is looking when Jesus got in a leadership multiplication phase, he talked a lot about death. And he said, unless a grain of wheat fall to the ground and die, it remains alone. But if it will die, it'll multiply. And part of what happens in these organizational life cycles is there's a kind of death for the leader in the transition from each phase to another. And it's hard, it's painful, because you have to die to something you know how to do. You have to die to things that are working. You have to die to roles that you like and things that you know. And but it's that death actually that then opens the door for, if you do it right, if you don't just die and if you die in obedience to Christ, following Him, that death is what opens the door to further growth.